There's a sound a man never forgets once he's heard it. Not the crack of a rifle, not the death cry of a steer or the scream of a spooked horse. Those sounds have grammar to them, a beginning, a reason, an end you can trace back to something visible in the daylight. No, the sound I'm talking about is smaller than all of that. It's the kind of sound that gets inside the back of your skull before your ears even fully register it. Like something wet and faint, caught behind wind. Like something that should not be alive, trying to remember how. I heard it behind Jensen's barn on a Thursday evening in October, 1887, when the sun was already bleeding out behind the bluffs, and the air carried the first real bite of coming winter. I was not a young man. I was not a brave one, either not in the foolish, charging forward way people mean when they use that word. I had survived 41 years on the frontier by learning when to step back, when to keep my mouth shut, when to pretend I hadn't seen something because seeing it would cost me more than I could pay. I almost did that. I almost turned around. But the sound came again. And something in me, some old, stubborn, half-broken thing that I'd tried for years to properly kill, moved toward it instead. What I found in that darkness behind the barn changed the shape of every year I'd lived before it, and every year I've lived since. I keep a log, have kept one since 1869. 14 journals, filled edge to edge with small handwriting I can barely read myself now. I never intended for anyone to see them, but this story, her story, has lived in my chest too long to stay only in those pages. So here it is. My name is Callum Reed, and I have made it a point, across the whole of my adult life, not to be the sort of man who goes looking for trouble. That's not cowardice, that's arithmetic. You spend enough seasons on the frontier, enough winters where you're rationing wood, enough summers where the ground cracks so deep it sounds like the earth itself is complaining, and you develop a finely tuned understanding of what a man can and cannot carry. I had learned my limits. I had built a life inside them. I ran a small cattle operation 8 miles northeast of Prescott, in the Arizona Territory. 23 head, a decent well, a house that didn't leak in more than 2 places, and a reputation for being quiet, reliable, and uninterested in other men's affairs. My neighbor to the south was a German immigrant named Heinz who made good sausage and terrible whiskey. My neighbor to the north was a man called Frank Jensen. I did not like Frank Jensen. That's not a thing I say lightly. I'm not a man who dislikes people on principle or on rumors or on the kind of idle gossip that passes between ranchers at the feed store in town. I had watched Jensen for 3 years before I let myself use that word, dislike. And even then I used it carefully, quietly, only inside my own head, the way you use a match near dry grass. Jensen was the kind of man who was friendly in the way that some dogs are friendly, showing teeth, wagging, and you could never quite be sure which he was actually doing. He was large. He was loud at the saloon and soft-spoken in the daylight, and that particular combination had always made something in my gut go sideways. He ran cattle, kept 2 hired hands who never stayed more than a season, and lived alone on the north side of his property in a house that was large enough for a family he'd never had or never kept. I had reasons for the dislike, small reasons accumulated over time. The way his cattle always seemed to be grazing 10 yards too far south, into my grass, and when I'd mentioned it once, diplomatically, he'd laughed and said grass doesn't know property lines. Read like that was a philosophy and not a theft. The way one of his hands had come to me in the 2nd year, a young man named Tobias, pale as chalk and shaking at the hands, asking if I had work, any at all, he'd sleep in the barn, he didn't care, and when I'd asked why he was leaving Jensen's employ so sudden, the boy had looked down at his boots and said only I just can't stay there no more. I'd given him 2 days' work and a meal and never pressed him. He'd moved on east. And there was the matter of the Apache woman. I had first seen her in August, 2 months before the night that changed everything. I was riding the fence line on my north boundary, a chore I hated, but that I did every 2 weeks with the dedication of a man who had learned, once, what a broken fence costs, and I had come around the scrub oak at the corner post and seen her. She was standing at the far end of Jensen's yard, near the water trough, wearing a dress that was wrong for her in a way that was hard to articulate but impossible to miss. Not wrong in size, exactly, but wrong in the way a word is wrong when it's used in the right sentence by the wrong mouth. A calico dress, faded blue, buttoned to the collar despite the August heat. Her hair was long and dark and loose, which was unusual, and she was standing very still in the manner of a person who has learned that stillness is safer than movement. I watched her for maybe 4 seconds before she turned and saw me watching. She didn't move, she didn't speak. She looked at me with eyes that were neither afraid nor hopeful, which is a particular expression I have only ever seen on people who have gone past both of those things and come out somewhere quieter and more frightening on the other side. Then Jensen came out of the barn behind her and said something I couldn't hear at that distance, and she turned away from me like a door closing, and I rode on. I thought about her that evening, made a note in my log, just 3 words: woman, Jensen's, August. I didn't know what to make of it. The territory had Apache people throughout it. That was simply a fact of the land. Some worked for wages on ranches, some had arrangements I didn't fully understand and didn't try to, some were prisoners of a system that called itself civilization and behaved like something else entirely. I didn't know which category she fell into. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself that 12 more times over the following 2 months. Each time a different detail surfaced in the peripheral vision of my days. The way she was never in the yard when Jensen was absent, only when he was present and watching. The way she moved, always slightly ahead of where he was pointing, like she knew what direction the expectation was coming from before he expressed it. The way once, at a distance, I thought I heard her laugh, a real laugh, unexpected, at something a bird did, and the way it cut off so completely and suddenly that I turned in my saddle to look and Jensen was standing 6 feet away, and the silence where the laugh had been was somehow louder than the laugh itself. But none of that was evidence of anything definitive. None of it was a thing I could put into words that didn't sound like paranoia or a man with too much time and too empty a house building stories to fill it. So I kept noting small things in my journal, and I kept writing my fence line, and I kept telling myself it wasn't my business. Until October 9th, 1887. I had gone to Jensen's property that evening on a legitimate errand. One of my steers had broken through the north fence, and I had tracked it to his eastern pasture, and I needed to retrieve it before dark. Jensen's hired man, a taciturn fellow named Grubb, let me in at the gate without comment and pointed toward the pasture, and I rode through the yard and did not see Jensen anywhere and did not see her anywhere, and I found my steer without much trouble and was heading back when the horse shied. My horse, a 13-year-old bay mare named Temperance who had an excellent and justified reputation for being unflappable, shied hard left and blew through her nose in the way that meant something is wrong with the air here, Callum, and I want to leave. Temperance had saved my life twice by being right about air. I did not dismiss her. I stopped, I listened. Wind in the scrub, a distant dog somewhere, the low sound of Jensen's cattle settling for the night. And then underneath all of that, something else. Small, barely there. The kind of sound you'd tell yourself you imagined if you were a man with a particular talent for looking away from things. I was not, it turned out, that man after all. I dismounted, tied Temperance to the fence post. She accepted this with a deep, expressive sigh that communicated her opinion clearly and walked toward the barn. Jensen's barn was a large structure, well built, which was one of the things I'd always grudgingly noted about him. He spent money on his animals' comfort, if not on his hired men's. The main doors faced east. I'd come around the south side, tracking the sound, which was taking on a quality now that made the back of my neck go tight. It was human. I was nearly certain it was human. I came around the northwest corner of the barn, where the shadow was thickest. The sun completely gone now, and the first stars beginning, and the air suddenly 10 degrees colder than it had any right to be. And I stopped. There was a small lean-to addition on the back of the barn. I hadn't known about it, couldn't have seen it from the road or from my property. Built low to the ground with rough wood walls, and what looked like a salvaged door with a heavy iron bar latched across it from the outside. And from behind that door, so faint it was barely above breath, came the sound. My heart did something complicated. It sped up and then slowed down, and then seemed to briefly forget what it was supposed to be doing, which was a new experience for an organ I'd taken for granted for 4 decades. I stood outside that latched door for what felt like a long time, but was probably 15 seconds. 15 seconds in which I thought about every reason to walk back to my horse and ride home. 15 seconds in which I had a brief, vivid imagining of what Jensen's face would look like if he came around the corner and found me here. 15 seconds in which the small sound behind the door came again, with slightly more urgency, like whatever was making it had heard me stop, and was trying to reach through solid wood. I lifted the iron bar. The door swung outward on leather hinges that needed oil, and the darkness inside was the particular quality of darkness that has been sealed in somewhere long enough to develop a smell. Cold, earth, something organic and frightening underneath. I couldn't see anything at all for the first 2 seconds, and then my eyes adjusted the way they do when you've spent enough time outdoors to have calibrated vision. And what I saw made me go very still in a way that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with something breaking open behind my sternum. She was on the floor. The calico dress, which had been faded blue in August, was now something closer to gray in the way that fabric goes when it's been worn too long through dirt and weather and God knows what else. She was sitting with her back against the far wall, and her wrists, both of them, were secured to an iron ring bolted low in the wood above her head with chain. The chain was not long. She could sit but not stand straight. She could move her hands perhaps 8 inches in either direction. She had been here for a while. I could see that without anyone telling me. She looked up when the light changed and I came into the doorframe, and I had a half-second of her face in what little starlight reached us, the expression, before she moved the expression away into something controlled and unreadable, the way people move things off a table when company comes. But I'd seen it, just the edge of it. She had looked for 1/2 of 1 second, like something that had given up and then been startled into hoping again. And that particular combination, in a face with that much self-possessed dignity in it, was the most devastating thing I had seen in 41 years of living in a world with no shortage of devastating things. "I'm not going to hurt you," I said. I know how useless that sounds, said by a stranger at a door in the dark. But I had to say something, and I didn't have anything better, and my voice came out quieter than I intended, which might have been the most honest thing about it. She didn't speak. She watched me with those eyes that had gone back to their careful default, not afraid, not hopeful, somewhere past both. And I stood in the doorway and looked at the chain and the iron ring and the bolt work, which was not amateur work, which was the work of someone who had thought about this and made it permanent. My hands were shaking. I noticed this at a remove, the way you notice something happening to a person you're watching from a distance. I have been in difficult situations. I have been in situations that required steadiness. I had never felt my hands shake like this before, and the reason they were shaking was not fear of Jensen, though that was there too, solid and cold in my stomach. They were shaking because I had just understood, in the complete and total way that some understandings arrive, that I had ridden past this barn 80 or 90 times in 3 years. I had heard things, noted things, and ridden on. I turned around and looked back at the dark yard. No lights in Jensen's house, no sign of grub. The night was very quiet. I turned back to her. "I'm going to get you out of here," I said, "if you'll let me." She still didn't speak. But she held up her wrists, both of them together, the chain clinking, matter of fact as if she were showing me a broken fence post that needed fixing. And the gesture was so dignified, and so completely without self-pity that something in my throat closed up, and I had to look down at the chain and concentrate very hard on the practical problem of it to keep from doing something unhelpful with my face. The lock on the chain was a padlock, solid, the kind that doesn't yield to creativity. I didn't have bolt cutters. What I had was a pocket knife, a length of rope on my saddle, my steer still tied at Jensen's pasture gate, which I had completely forgotten about, and about 45 minutes before Grub would likely do his final round of the property. I crouched down to get a closer look at the ring the chain was attached to, and at this closer range, I could see other things I hadn't seen from the doorway. The marks on her wrists where the chain had been long enough. The way she was holding her left shoulder slightly different from her right, careful. A half-healed cut along her jaw that someone had not tended properly. I looked at the iron ring. It was bolted through the wood wall into what felt, when I pressed my palm against it, like it might be a secondary frame piece inside the wall. The bolts were large. I didn't have a wrench. But I had a rock. I'm not proud of the elegance of the solution. I found a rock the size of both my fists from the dirt floor, and I worked at the bolt heads for 11 minutes. I counted. I always count. It's the quirk that has kept me functional in situations where doing nothing was the alternative. And I stripped 2 of the 4 bolt heads badly before the third one began to move. And by the time the fourth one let go, I had skinned 3 knuckles and made enough noise that I was holding my breath between each blow, listening. The ring pulled away from the wall. She stood up. She was taller than I'd realized. And the first thing she did, once her hands were free of the wall, the chain still on her wrists but the ring hanging loose now at the end of it, was stand up straight. All the way straight. Like it mattered to her, like it was the first thing, the restoration of full height, before anything else. It probably was. "Can you walk?" I asked. "Yes," she said. First word. Her voice was low and not frayed around the edges the way I might have expected from someone who'd been in that space for I didn't know how long. It was precise. English clean without hesitation. "My horse is at the fence post north side," I said. "There's a steer at the east pasture gate I have to pretend I'm retrieving. When I walk out of here, I need you to." "I know this property," she said quietly. "I know the pattern of when grub walks." She looked at the dark rectangle of the doorway past my shoulder. "He does not come this side until the second bell of the night." I looked at her. "You've been planning." Something moved in her face, not quite what I'd call amusement, but adjacent to it, the kind of expression that lives right next to humor when humor is too expensive to fully afford. "I have been planning," she said, "since the second week." "How long have you?" 11 weeks, she said. 11 weeks, October back to late July. The summer. All of August and September when I'd been riding that fence line, when I'd seen her standing at the water trough. I didn't say anything. There was nothing I could say that would have been adequate to that number, and she was already moving toward the doorway with the careful precision of someone who has spent a long time moving quietly, and the chain was still on her wrists catching what starlight there was, and I was a step behind her. We came out into the yard. The night air hit different after the sealed darkness of the lean-to. Cold and wide and smelling of cattle and dust and the faint sweetness of dried grass. She breathed it in once deeply with her eyes closed, and that one breath, the deliberate taking of it, the way she held it for just a moment before letting it go, was private enough that I looked away. "My name is Callum Reed," I said to the darkness in front of us. A pause, long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then, Nijoni. I hadn't heard the name before. I filed it in the front of my mind where important things went. We moved across the yard. She was right about Grub's pattern, no sign of him, no lamplight from his shed, and we reached Temperance at the fence post without incident. My steer was at the east gate, looking martyred, which was also Temperance's expression as I came to untie her. "I need to take the steer," I said. "If I leave without it, Grub notices. Can you ride?" "I can ride," she said. I boosted her up onto Temperance. She had to hold the saddle horn with chained hands, which was awkward and undignified, and she handled it with the same complete lack of complaint with which she had handled everything else. And I took the lead rope of the steer, and we walked out of Jensen's property in the dark, quiet and careful, and I didn't fully breathe until we were a quarter-mile away, and the lights of Jensen's house were small behind us. We were halfway to my property when she spoke again. "You came back for the steer," she said, not a question. "Yes." "You did not come for me." "No," I said. "I didn't know." I stopped, started again. "I should have." She considered this for a time, measuring it against something I couldn't see. "You did not know," she said finally. Not absolving me, just stating it the way you state a fact about terrain. And then, "You came when you heard." "Yes." "Then," she said, and I could not read the full weight of what was in that word, "you came." We reached my property. I unsaddled Temperance, settled the steer, and brought Nijoni inside my house, which felt inadequate and strange. A small house, a man's house, sparse in the particular way that a house gets when only one person lives in it for a long time and stops seeing the emptiness. I lit the lamp and got a better look at her in the yellow light, and the better look confirmed and worsened everything I'd seen in the dark of the lean-to. I didn't have much by way of medical supplies, but I had what most ranchers kept, carbolic, clean rags, needle and gut for stitching if it came to that. I put water on the stove. I put food on the table without asking because she needed it, and asking seemed like a waste of words that she could be using to eat instead. She ate with the focus of someone doing something important, methodically, not ravenous in a way that lost dignity, but serious about it, the way you are serious about a task that matters. I watched the lamp and pretended I wasn't watching her and made notes in my log with one hand while she ate. After a while she said, "You write." "Habit," I said. "I've kept a log since '69. "What do you write in it?" "Things I see, things I'm trying to understand." A pause. Are you writing about me? I wrote October 9th. Woman named Nijoni, Jensen's lean-to, 11 weeks, chain. I looked up. I'll write more when I know more if you'll tell me. She looked at my journal for a moment, at the small, cramped handwriting across the page. Then she looked at me with a directness that felt like being examined by something very old and very precise. My people do not write things down, she said. We remember them. I know, I said. I'm sorry my memory isn't better. Something shifted in her face at that. Very small, almost nothing. The kind of shift that takes years of paying attention to the frontier to even detect, where expression is currency and people spend it carefully. What will you do, she said, with this story you are writing? I sat with that question. Out the window, Jensen's property was a distant darkness. Come morning, Grubb would find the lean-to empty, the ring pulled from the wall, and a trail easy enough to follow for an 8-mile ride. I don't know yet, I said honestly. I know what I won't do. She waited. I won't let you go back there. She looked at me for a long time. The lamp guttered once in a draft from the ill-fitting window I kept meaning to fix, and the light shifted across her face, and I saw that what I had taken at the barn for the absence of fear was not quite that. It was something more complicated. It was the face of a person who had made a separate peace with fear, had looked at it, sized it up, decided to carry it rather than be carried by it. And that was a different and more costly thing than simply not being afraid. There is more, she said, than just me. I stopped writing, looked up. She was holding both chained wrists on the table between us, the iron ring from the wall still dangling at the end, and she was watching me with those careful eyes, and what she said next changed the geometry of the whole night and everything that came after. There are others. The lamp threw shadows up the wall. Outside, far away in the direction of Jensen's property, something, a coyote, probably just a coyote, made a sound in the dark. I picked up my pen. Tell me, I said. And she did. There is a specific quality to the silence that comes after a person tells you something that reconfigures the world. I've experienced it twice in my life before this night. Once when a man told me my father had died, and once when a woman told me she was leaving for Oregon and would not be back, and both times it had the same character. A held-breath stillness, like the room itself was waiting to see what shape things would take going forward. When Nijoni finished speaking, that silence came down around us like weather. The lamp was lower. I hadn't trimmed the wick. It had been nearly 2 hours since she began, and what she had laid out over those 2 hours, in her flat, careful, precise voice, the voice of a woman who had spent a great deal of time organizing terrible things into a form she could carry without being destroyed by them, was not a story that resolved neatly into anything. It was a map. A functional, devastating map of something I had been riding past, 8 miles away, for 3 years. I'll set it down the way she told it to me. Her name, her full name, the one she gave me that night, was Nijoni Running Waiter, and she was 26 years old, and she was Dene, not Apache, though the distinction meant nothing to Jensen and had not protected her from the series of events that brought her to that lean-to. She had 2 younger brothers and a mother who was alive as of the previous winter, living on a reservation 60 miles northeast of Prescott. She had been educated at a mission school. She said this with a tone that was neither gratitude nor resentment, but some third thing I didn't have a word for. And she read English well and spoke it without difficulty, and had, before all of this, worked 2 seasons as a translator and domestic worker for a family in Prescott who had treated her with what she described as adequate fairness. The family had sold their house and moved to California in June of last year. She had been without employment. She had heard through a complicated chain of word of mouth, the way that information moves through communities that cannot afford to use newspapers, that a rancher north of Prescott was hiring domestic work, cooking, washing, general household. 2 weeks trial wages discussed. The rancher was Frank Jensen. She had arrived in the 2nd week of July. She had understood by the end of the first day that the job was not what had been described. She had understood by the end of the first week that she was not going to be permitted to leave. There was no single dramatic moment she could point to, she told me. It was more like the gradual revelation of a structure that had been there from the beginning, becoming visible incrementally. The way fog lifts off a landscape, and you realize you've been looking at a cliff the whole time. Jensen had not been violent immediately. He had been restrictive. Her movements on the property were directed and controlled. Her interactions with Grubb were scripted. When Grubb asked how she was finding the work, Jensen was always present for the answer, positioned in the specific way of a person who is not precisely threatening, but who is reminding you of the nature of consequences. After 3 weeks, when she had tried to leave, had simply one morning walked toward the gate, Jensen had demonstrated that the arrangement was not voluntary. She told me this part quickly and without embellishment, and she moved on immediately, and I let her, because she knew what she needed to tell me and in what order, and interfering with that architecture with my own reactions would have been selfish. In the 2nd month, she had been moved to the lean-to. She told me why, and I'm going to write it here because I think it needs to be on the page in the record, even though it is difficult. Jensen had received a visitor, a man who came by arrangement, not by chance with money. She did not know the man's name. He stayed 2 nights and then left, and Nijoni had been moved to the lean-to the following morning, and the chain and the iron ring had been there already, which meant Jensen had been planning for a use for them before she arrived. It was, she said, a transaction, and it had happened before she came and would happen again after, and this was the part that sat heaviest in my chest. There were other properties. She had heard Jensen and Grubb speaking through the lean-to wall on nights when they did not know she was awake. There were 2 other locations, one south, direction unclear, one east, possibly near Wickenburg. Other women, she did not know how many, she did not know their names. I had been writing continuously through all of this, the scratching of my pen the only sound between her words. When she finished, I sat with my pen still in my hand and looked at what I had written. 12 pages, small handwriting, the full span of what I was holding. Outside, the darkness was beginning to lighten in the way it does in the last hour before dawn, not brighter exactly, but different, like the air changing its posture. We had been inside most of the night. "You've been planning," I said. "You said since the 2nd week." "Yes." "What was the plan?" She looked at her chained wrists. "The plan changed," she said, "many times. I had a plan that required the right tool, and I could not get the tool. I had a plan that required Grubb to be absent at a specific time, and Grubb was never absent. I had several plans that required me to be stronger than I was by the time I was ready to try them." A pause. "I had one plan that I was 3 days away from completing when I heard you at the door." "What was that plan?" She looked at me for a moment. Then she held up the chain, showed me the ring I had pulled from the wall. "I had loosened 2 of the 4 bolts," she said, "with my fingers over 6 weeks. I looked at the bolt heads. In the lamplight I could see what I hadn't seen in the dark, the scoring marks around 2 of them, not from my rock work. Older. Worked down gradually, patiently, methodically, with the kind of sustained effort that only exists in a person who has made an absolute decision to keep going regardless of how long it takes. 6 weeks with her fingers. I thought about my 11 minutes with a rock and my stripped knuckles, and my admittedly quite sincere sense of accomplishment at the time. "I see," I said. "You were faster," she said, and that thing that lived next to humor moved in her face again. I had to get up from the table. I went to the window and looked out at my dark yard, my well, my stock pen, the small shape of Temperance in the corral being deeply unimpressed by the stars. And I stood there for a minute and did the thing I sometimes do when the log fills up with things I don't know how to process. I made myself breathe at a regulated pace, in through the nose, out slow, the way the old Navajo man who had worked for me one summer had once, without context, shown me, saying only when the water is troubled you don't see the bottom. I'd always meant to tell him how useful that was. I'd never gotten the chance. I turned back around. "The sheriff in Prescott is a man named Aldous Ferris," I said. "He's been sheriff for 7 years. He's not a bad man. He is, however, a practical man." Nijoni looked at me with an expression that said she understood perfectly what I meant by practical. "He will need physical evidence and testimony," I said. "The chain is evidence. What you've told me tonight is testimony. What I observed over 3 years is testimony for whatever it's worth. The marks on your wrists and your shoulder and your jaw are evidence." I paused. "The bolts you loosened over 6 weeks with your fingers through a wall are evidence of something that I don't have a good word for yet." "There is an Apache word," she said. "What is it?" She said a word I could not spell or reproduce. "What does it mean?" "It means," she considered, "it means the force that moves when everything else has stopped moving." When all other forces are exhausted. She paused. It is used for water finding its way through stone, for the root of a tree that breaks apart a rock over 100 years, for a person. She stopped. For a person who spends 6 weeks loosening bolts with her fingers, I said. She said nothing, but she did not look away. I pulled my chair back to the table and sat down and picked up my pen and turned to a fresh page. I need you to tell me everything you remember about the other locations, everything Grubb said, every name Jensen used, every direction, time, any descriptor you can think of. I looked up. I know you've already told me more than you should have to tell anyone. I know this is... I stopped. I didn't have an adequate end to that sentence. I'm going to write it all down. And then we're going to figure out what to do with it. She looked at me for a moment, at the journal, at the pen, at my face. Why, she said. I understood what she was asking. Not why do you want the information, but the larger thing. The thing that had been behind every interaction we'd had since the barn door opened. Why you? Why now? What is it to you? I thought about Tobias, who had come to my fence shaking and white and said I just can't stay there no more. I thought about 80 or 90 rides past that barn. I thought about the 3 words in my August log entry, woman, Jensen's, and how easily I had told myself it wasn't my business. I can't put it back, I said. What I know now, I can't go back to not knowing it. And I've spent 3 years telling myself that things were happening at that property that weren't my business, and I stopped again, looked down at the journal. I was wrong about that, and I don't like being wrong, but I especially don't like being wrong about something that costs someone else and not me. She studied my face. The lamp guttered again in the draft. You are a man, she said, who writes things down so you don't have to carry them only in yourself. Yes, I said. Then write this, she said, and carry it with me, and maybe between 2 people it will not break either of us. I wrote. For another hour I wrote everything she told me, and she told me everything she remembered, which was a great deal because she had spent 11 weeks with nothing to do but listen and remember and plan. Names, 1 full name, 1 partial. Directions, south-southeast, she thought, based on the position of the sun she could see through a gap in the lean-to wall. A reference to a specific creek crossing that Jensen and Grubb had discussed in terms that suggested practical familiarity. A man referred to only as the Wickenburg connection. A time frame, Jensen had told someone, on the phone he made at the telegraph office in town, that the arrangement would be ready to rotate by the 1st of November, 3 weeks away. By the time she finished, the dawn was full in the east window and my hand ached, and I had 6 additional pages, and Nijoni was holding a coffee cup I'd given her with both hands, the chain resting on the table between us, and she looked not better exactly, not fixed in any visible way, but different from the lean-to, different from the yard, like something had expanded back into its proper space. I had a problem. I had, as I have said, a complicated relationship with Sheriff Ferris. He was not a dishonest man. But the territory in 1887 was not a place where a man arriving at the sheriff's office with a native woman and a story about a local rancher, and a chain was guaranteed a hearing that cost nothing to the woman and everything to the rancher. The arithmetic of credibility was not neutral. I knew this. Nijoni knew this better than I did. We talked about it plainly, which I appreciated. She was not a person who softened realities into comfortable shapes. She had spent 11 weeks staring at the real shape of things with nothing between her and it, and she had no patience left for comfortable shapes. Ferris will listen to me, I said. I have a reputation in this county. That shouldn't matter, but it does. And my testimony, she said, will be more powerful with mine alongside it. I know that's wrong, I know that. It is not wrong, she said with a firmness that stopped me. It is the thing that is true which is different from wrong. Wrong is Jensen. Wrong is the thing he built and operates. The fact that your voice carries more weight than mine in that office is also wrong, but it is a different size of wrong, and I know which one to fix first. I looked at her. You, she said, are very good at being troubled by things. It is, she seemed to search for the word. It is an interesting quality. Is it useful? Not yet, she said, but I think it might become useful. We agreed on 3 things before we left the house that morning. First, I would go to town ahead of her alone and speak to Ferris and get a measure of his disposition before her presence in the county was known. Second, she would stay at my property, in my house, not in the barn. I said this specifically, and she gave me a look that suggested she appreciated the specificity. with Temperance in the corral for the option of flight if Jensen or Grubb came before I returned. Third, if Ferris would not act or acted too slowly, we would go over his head to the territorial marshal, who I had met once at a cattle association meeting and who had struck me as a man with a more flexible sense of practical reality. I told her where the food was, where the spare blankets were, where I kept my spare revolver, which was under the left side of the bed. I told her this last thing matter-of-factly, and she accepted it the same way. At the door I stopped. "The bolt work," I said, 6 weeks. She looked at me. "Yes. I want to put that in the record, specifically. Not just the chain and the ring, the bolt work and what it took and how long." Something moved in her face again, a longer version of that thing adjacent to humor that lived just past it. "Why?" she said. "Because," I said, "whoever reads this record someday should know that the walls were not the strongest thing in that lean-to." She was quiet, then she said, "Callum Reed." "Yes." "Go to town," she said, "and come back." "I'll come back." "I know," she said. But the way she said it, careful and weighted, told me that knowing and trusting were two different distances, and that she was holding both of them at once, and that the holding cost her something, and that she was paying it anyway. I rode to Prescott. The town was 8 miles south, and the morning was cold and clear, the kind of October morning where the air tastes like metal and the sky is the particular blue that looks like it was made to be remembered. I let Temperance set her own pace on the first half and pushed her gently on the second. I was composing as I rode, not out loud, but in my head, the way I sometimes compose log entries before I write them, finding the shape of the thing. What I was composing was not a story, it was a case. There's a difference, though they use some of the same materials. A story works through emotion and connection, through the particular detail that makes you feel the truth of a thing. A case works through sequence and evidence, through the arrangement of facts into a structure that holds weight when pressed. I needed both, but I needed to know which door I was walking through first at Ferris's office. I knew Ferris was in when I arrived because his horse was at the post, and I could see the shape of him through the window glass, sitting at his desk with a cup of something. I tied up and went in. Aldous Ferris was 53 years old, gray as January, with a mustache that had given up on its ambitions and a face that was neither kind nor unkind but simply experienced. He'd been in the territory since before it was organized. He had a daughter in Phoenix who he talked about when he drank. He kept a Bible on his desk and a Derringer in his vest, and he had, on one occasion I knew of personally, walked into a situation that could have killed him to prevent something worse, which was the evidence I kept returning to when I tried to estimate him. He looked up when I came in. "Reed," he said. "Ferris," I said. I sat down across from his desk, without being invited, and put my journal on the surface between us, and opened it to October 9th. "I need you to read this," I said. "All of it, and then I need you to make a decision about Frank Jensen." He looked at the journal, looked at me. "Jensen," he said. "Read first," I said. He read slowly. His face did not move much while he read, which in a man of his particular caliber was not a reassuring sign. It meant he was keeping his reactions internal, which could mean many things, and I did not know yet which thing it meant in this case. He read for 12 minutes, flipped back, read one section again, then he looked up. "The woman," he said, "where is she?" "Safe," I said, "somewhere I'm not telling you yet." His eyes went careful. "Read." "I need to know," I said, "what you're going to do before I tell you where she is. I need to know what happens to her when I hand you that information." "You're asking me to commit before I have all the facts." "I'm asking you to tell me where your instinct is sitting," I said. "Right now, on what you've read." A long pause. He looked out the window. A wagon was going past on the street, a woman with a basket, 2 dogs, the ordinary texture of a town morning. He watched it like he was measuring something. "The chain," he said finally. "You still have it." "She still has it, on her wrists. We couldn't get the padlock open." He was quiet for another moment. Then, "If what's in this journal is accurate." "Every word." "Then what Jensen is running is not a small thing to take apart." He turned back to me. "I want to talk to her." "You can, under conditions." "What conditions?" "She's present for every conversation about her case. She is not moved, transported, or held anywhere without her explicit agreement." and the testimony she gives is recorded the same way mine would be recorded, in full, with equal evidentiary weight. Ferris looked at me for a long time, the kind of look that's doing real work, turning something over, finding its edges. Then he said, "You get this concerned about stray cattle often, Reed." "I should have come in here 3 years ago," I said. "I'm making up for it." He picked up his cup, found it empty, set it back down. "Get her," he said. "I'll have Hartley," that was his deputy, "keep quiet about this until we know the full shape. And I'll need everything you wrote and everything she can tell me, and then I'm going to need to make some quiet arrangements before Jensen knows we're looking at him." He paused. "The other locations." "The one near Wickenburg. She'll tell you what she heard. It's in the journal, too." "Wickenburg Marshal is a man I know," he said, slowly, thinking out loud. "And the territorial marshal." "I have a contact there, too," I said. He looked at me with something that might have been surprise, and might have been a recalibration. "Reed," he said, "you had a cattle operation." "I still do," I said. "The cattle are fine, they're very patient animals." He almost smiled. It was a close thing. He turned it back before it fully formed, which I found I respected. We made our arrangements. I rode back to my property, and Nijoni was exactly where I'd left her, at the kitchen table, with my spare revolver on the surface in front of her and both hands visible, and a second cup of coffee, and my 2 other journals she'd taken from the shelf and apparently been reading. She looked up when I came in. "Ferris," I said, "he'll see you. His terms are reasonable." She looked at me for a moment, then down at the journal in her hands. It was the 1871 one, which I was briefly embarrassed by because 1871 contained some extremely uncharitable observations about various people that had not aged particularly well. "You write everything," she said. "Yes," I said, "I told you." "This man," she said, pointing to a name on the page, "he is still alive." "I have no idea," I said honestly. "You wrote that he was," she read, "the most tedious human being I have encountered in 6 years of active frontier living, with the conversational range of a fence post and the emotional depth of a dry creek bed." "Well," I said. "A fence post," she said, "is structurally important." I may have been uncharitable. "A dry creek bed," she said, "held water once and will again." "I was 30, I said. "I was not generous with my assessments." She closed the 1871 journal and set it aside and stood up from the table. She picked up the spare revolver and turned it handle first toward me, setting it on the table the way you hand back something that belongs to someone else with care. "He'll need everything," she said. "Yes." "Then I'll tell him everything." She looked at the chain on her wrists. "But first," she said, "I would like very much for someone to remove this." I found the hacksaw in the barn. It took 20 minutes and some profanity on my part and a patience on hers that was by now completely unsurprising to me. And when the last link gave and the chain came away and she set it on the ground outside the barn and stepped back from it, she did not look at it. She looked up. At the sky, at the October blue that seemed unreasonable in its beauty relative to the circumstances. She rubbed her wrists, methodically, the way you restore circulation, practical and precise. Then she looked at me. "You said," she said, "that you would write what the walls were not." "I did." "Write also," she said, "that I walked out." I looked at her, at the chain on the ground, at her wrists without it, at the way she was standing all the way straight, the same way she had stood the first moment the ring came free from the wall. "I'll write it," I said. She nodded, looked at the sky one more time, then looked at the road south toward Prescott. "Then let's go," she said. The thing about justice, in the Arizona Territory in 1887, is that it moved at the speed of horses, paperwork, and the willingness of men with authority to use it in the directions that made them uncomfortable. I want to be honest about what happened next. Because the version of events that I have told people since, at the feed store, at the cattle association meetings, in the careful abbreviated form I have given to people who asked, is a cleaner version. A version with a more satisfying progression. What actually happened was messier. It was frustrating and slow and cost more than I had expected it to, in ways I had not predicted, and in ways that made me revise, substantially and permanently, what I thought I knew about the machinery of the world I lived in. But I told it honest to my journal, and my journal is what I'm working from now. We arrived at Ferris's office in the early afternoon of October 10th. Nijoni and I, and the chain, and my 12 pages of notes, and a composure in her that I had stopped being surprised by and started being educated by. Ferris received her. He asked his questions, not without gentleness, or what passed for gentleness in a man of his type, which was a kind of economy of assumption. He didn't make her explain things she hadn't offered, didn't push into the parts she moved through quickly, didn't look at her the way some men looked at women who'd been through what she'd been through, like it was a thing that now characterized her permanently rather than a thing that had happened to her while she remained entirely herself. His deputy Hartley was present and silent, and took his own notes. It went on for 3 hours. At the end of it, Ferris leaned back in his chair and put both hands on the edge of the desk in the way of a man who has reached a decision and is about to state it. "I'll send for Jensen tomorrow morning," he said. "I'll make it routine, a question about a land dispute, something he'll come in for without taking alarm. I'll have Hartley and Wilson at the property from before dawn to document the lean-to and the wall before anything gets altered." "And the other locations," I said. "I'm writing to the Wickenburg Marshal tonight, and to the Territorial Marshal's office." He looked at Nijoni. "The information you gave us, the creek crossing reference, the timing Jensen mentioned, that's specific enough to work from. It's going to take time." "How much time?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. I recognized this quiet. It was the quiet of a man who knows the honest answer and is calculating whether the honest answer is useful. "Tell me," she said, flat, not hostile, just requiring it. "Weeks," he said. "Possibly 2 months to do it properly, to get the Wickenburg location identified and watched before they can warn each other. If I move too fast on Jensen and the others get word." "The women there," she said. "Yes," he said, "that's the problem." She sat with that. I watched her working through it, could see the process in her face the way you see current in a river beneath the surface doing its work. She was, I had come to understand, a person who processed things completely before she responded to them, which was a quality I associated with people who had learned that impulsive reactions cost more than they saved. 2 months, she said, for all of them. I'll do everything I can to shorten it. If you tell Jensen before you have the others. The women there will be moved or worse, he said. I know. I'm not moving on Jensen until we have the Wickenburg location and the other one she described. She nodded then. Where do I stay during those months? This had been my question too, and I had already proposed an answer to Ferris before she arrived, which Ferris had received with the expression of a man trying to identify whether what he was hearing was problematic. Reed's offered his property, Ferris said. As the documented witness and the person who brought you in, that makes some practical sense. It also puts you in a difficult. It is practical, she said. She looked at me. If you are willing. I proposed it, I said. He proposed it, Ferris confirmed. A pause. I don't want to be a difficulty for you, she said to me. You are not a difficulty for me, I said. You are a responsibility I should have taken on approximately 2 months ago. She looked at me for a moment with those measuring eyes. Then she looked back at Ferris. I will also, she said, need to send word to my family. I can help with that, Ferris said. He had reached for a pen before she'd finished the sentence, which was the right thing to do, and I made a note of it. So that was the arrangement. And for the next 7 weeks, which I will be honest with you about in all their complicated texture, Nijoni Runningwaiter lived in my house, and I lived in my house, and we had to figure out the particular and strange geometry of that. It was not simple. It was not romantic, in case your imagination is moving in that direction, which I understand because human minds do move toward certain shapes when presented with certain materials. I am 51 years old now, writing this, and I am capable of telling you plainly, what existed between us during those 7 weeks was not romance. It was something else. Something I don't have a clean word for, and I've spent 11 years trying to find one. Something that forms between two people who have held up opposite ends of the same unbearable thing and walked together under its weight without putting it down. The first 2 weeks were difficult in a logistical sense. I had 1 bedroom, which I gave to her. I slept in the front room with an arrangement I built out of a cot and 2 spare blankets that was functional if not comfortable. I made meals in the morning. She made meals in the evening, which she did with a precision and an efficiency that made my own cooking look like I was performing a rough improvisation. She discovered that my supply of coffee was adequate, but my supply of dried chili was embarrassing, and she sent me to town with a list the second week with a matter-of-factness that I found I liked. We talked, in the evenings after dinner, with the lamp between us and the wind outside doing what October wind does in the territory. We talked about things that had nothing to do with Jensen or Ferris or the case, a choice I think we both made without discussing it, an instinctive agreement that the room needed to hold something else sometimes. She told me about the reservation, about her brothers, about her mother's specific and strongly held opinions about the correct way to make fry bread, which she told me with a warmth that made the room feel larger. I told her about 1869, about why I started keeping a journal, about my father who had wanted me to be a schoolteacher, and had expressed this desire with a combination of hope and disappointment that I had spent 30 years processing. She read my journals, all 14 of them over the 7 weeks. She did not ask permission. She had asked implicitly with the first one in the kitchen that first morning, and I had not told her to stop, which she correctly interpreted as assent. She read them with the focused attention she brought to everything, and occasionally flagged something with a sliver of bark from the kindling pile as a bookmark. And sometimes she would say, over dinner, "You were more afraid in 74 than you write like you were," or "This man you describe in 78, the Navajo man who showed you the breathing. His name is in how you write about him even though you never write his name." And I would sit with that for a while. She was right about the 74 entry. I had been more afraid than I'd written. I had dressed it up as professional calm, which was a lie I'd told myself so often it had become the thing I believed. She had read straight through to the truth of it in 2 minutes. On the 18th day, Hartley came out to the property with a telegram from the Wickenburg marshal. They had identified the location. A property east of Wickenburg owned by a man named Cresswell who had a documented relationship with Jensen going back 4 years. They were watching it. There were 2 women. Hartley didn't have more details. I told Najoni. She sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface for a minute. 2 women, unknown names, unknown conditions, still there. "Is it enough?" she asked. "Ferris needs another week at minimum," I said, "to coordinate the arrests simultaneously, if he moves on Jensen while Wickenburg isn't ready." "I know," she said, "I know." She pressed her palms against the table. "A week. Maybe 10 days. She looked out the window. It was November by now, the light coming in thin and early winter pale. "I know this is the right way," she said. "I know if he moves too soon." She stopped. "Knowing a thing is necessary does not make waiting for it easy." "No," I said, "it doesn't." She looked back at me. "You have a word for that. I've seen it in your journals, the gap between knowing and bearing." "Which word?" "You wrote it in 76, after you knew your father had died but before the funeral. You wrote," she picked up the 1876 journal from the stack on the shelf without looking, opened it directly to the page, which should have surprised me, but by that point nothing about her memory surprised me, and read, "The gap between knowing a thing and being able to carry it is not a failure of nerve, but simply the distance a person has to cross. It takes the time it takes. The crossing is not a weakness, it is just the walk." I looked at my own handwriting. At 51, looking back at 30-year-old Callum Reed, who had been writing that as much to convince himself as to record it. "I wrote that," I said. "Yes," she said, "it's a good sentence." She set the journal down. "I've been crossing since July. I think I've crossed most of it now." She looked at the window again. "I just want the walk to be over." 10 days, I said. 10 days, she said. On the 23rd day of November, 1887, at approximately 4 in the morning, Aldous Ferris and 2 deputies rode onto Frank Jensen's property. At approximately the same time, the Wickenburg marshal and 3 men arrived at the Cresswell property east of Wickenburg. A third location, the southern one Najoni had half remembered from overheard conversations, had been identified in the intervening weeks by a contact of the territorial marshals and was handled by federal officers. Jensen did not come quietly. I don't have first-hand account of the arrest. I was not there, which was Ferris's call and the right one, legally. But Hartley told me afterward that Jensen had attempted to characterize the entire situation as a misunderstanding of a domestic arrangement, with a composure that Hartley found so unsettling it had made him grip his rifle harder just to have something to hold. The Wickenburg women, their names were Clara and Emmeline. I know this only because the Wickenburg marshal wrote it in his official report and Ferris showed me the report, were recovered. I don't know their conditions in detail, and I don't write speculation in my journal. The southern location yielded 1 woman. 4 total recovered. I made a note, 23 November 1887. Jensen arrested, 3 locations. 4 women recovered, chain on my shelf as evidence. And then I sat with my pen over the page and could not write anything else for a while. Nijoni was at the table across from me. She had been sitting there since before dawn, since I'd gotten the knock at the door from Hartley with the update, and she had listened, and she had not cried. I want to put this in the record because I think people read into the absence of tears a kind of strength that misses the point. She was not dry-eyed because she felt less than a person who weeps. She was dry-eyed because she had been living with all of it for months, and some things are not surprising enough, when they finally resolve, to produce the kind of shock that generates tears. What she had was something quieter and in some ways harder. A long, slow release of something she had been holding so tightly, and for so long that the releasing of it had to happen in small increments. Because if it all let go at once, it would have taken her legs out from under her. She told me her mother's name that morning. She hadn't told me before. She told me it then, just said it in the kitchen, looking at her coffee. I wrote it in the journal. I will not write it here because it belongs to her and to her mother and not to this document. I want to go home, she said. Yes, I said. Not yet, she said. Ferris needs. A few weeks, the formal record, testimony again on the record this time, signed. And then I go home. Yes. She looked at the journal still open in front of me, at the stopped pen, at the line I had written and then the white space after it. What will you write, she said, after this is done? I thought about it. I'll write that it happened, I said, all of it from the beginning as accurately as I can. And what will you say was the most important thing? I had not thought about this yet. I sat with it for a moment the way she sat with things, completely, before answering. The bolt work, I said, 6 weeks with your fingers. She looked at me. Everything else, I said, depended on what you had already done before I opened that door. Ferris, the arrests, the other locations, all of it depended on you being there to tell it to someone. And you being there to tell it depended on you being alive and coherent and still planning at 11 weeks. And you being alive and coherent and planning depended on. On deciding, she said quietly. On deciding, I agreed. She nodded, set her coffee cup down, straightened the spoons on the table. I had noticed this. She straightened small things when she was thinking. It was a small gesture I had stopped reading as nervousness and started reading as simply the way she organized the surface of things while she organized the interior of things. I made the decision in the 3rd day, she said. I decided I was not going to die in that room. That was the first decision. After that, everything was a way of keeping that decision alive. She paused. There were days when keeping it alive took most of what I had, but a pause. I had made the decision before I had the energy to act on it. The decision kept the energy coming. I wrote that down immediately. She waited while I wrote it. That, she said when I looked up, you can put in your document. I already did. She almost smiled. It was the closest she had come to a full smile in the 7 weeks, and it arrived quietly, like the particular November light in the east window, without announcing itself. 3 weeks later, she gave her formal testimony to Ferris with a federal officer present, and I sat in the corner and wrote every word. She told it completely and without flinching and without performing either, which is a harder thing than it sounds. The temptation when you are making a record of injustice is to shade toward drama, because drama is what you believe will make people believe you, and that temptation comes from a correct assessment of people's limitations. She resisted it. She told it plainly, and the plainness of it was the most devastating thing in the room. Jensen was held for trial. The trial, which is a story for another document, longer and more complicated and more mixed in its satisfactions than the arrests, was set for the spring. She left on the 17th of December. Ferris arranged a transport east toward the reservation with a man I knew, a freighter named Lowell who was a decent person and a steady driver. I had packed what food I could spare, 2 days' worth, wrapped in oilcloth, and I was adding it to Lowell's wagon when she came out of the house. She was carrying both of my journals from 1887, the pages I'd filled from October through December. She held them out to me. "You should keep these," I said. "I know," she said, "but I want to read them again first." She looked at them. "I'll return them when I come back for the trial in spring." "You don't have to come back for the trial," I said. "Ferris has your written testimony, the federal officer's record you've done." "I know I don't have to," she said. I looked at her. She looked at me. "I'll have them ready for you when you come back," I said. She nodded, tucked the journals into the bag she'd put together, a small bag, her things, some things I'd given her that she'd accepted with the practicality she brought to everything. She climbed up onto the wagon bench beside Lowell with no help and more ease than she'd had in October, which was something. Lowell clicked to the team. The wagon moved. She looked back once as the wagon turned onto the road south. Not long, just a glance, the kind of glance that is not a farewell but an acknowledgement, that there was something here worth noting as it receded. I raised my hand. She turned back to the road. I stood in my yard in the December cold for a while after the wagon was gone. Then I went inside and sat at the table and opened my current journal. The new one started November 24th and wrote, 17 December 1887. Nijoni left for the reservation, weather clear, Lowell driving. She has the 87 journals. She said she'll return them in spring for the trial. The house is very quiet. There are two things I know now that I did not know on October 9th. The first is that the distance between riding past something and riding toward it is exactly the length of a sound in the dark. The second is that the walls were not the strongest thing in that lean-to. They never were. I don't have a word yet for what she is. The Apache word she gave me, the one about water finding stone. I asked her to write it for me before she left, and she wrote it in Dene Bizod in the inside cover of the 1871 journal. I don't know how to read it yet. I'm going to learn. I closed the journal. Outside, the December wind was doing what December wind does in the territory. Somewhere 8 miles north, Jensen's property sat empty, locked, documented, waiting for the mechanics of justice to finish their slow, unglamorous work. Somewhere to the east, a wagon was carrying 2 of my journals and a woman who had loosened 4 bolts through a wall with her fingers over 6 weeks, and then on the 7th week had walked out into the night and breathed like it mattered. I made coffee, I sat by the window, I watched the road. I don't know what to call the thing that made her last 11 weeks in that room with the decision intact. I know what she called it, the word for water through stone, the word for roots through rock. I know what I wrote inadequately in the margins of a different page, the force that moves when everything else has stopped moving. She told me once, in the 3rd week she was at my property, that the hardest part was not the physical constraint, not the cold, not the hunger, not the isolation, though all of those were present and real. The hardest part was the particular silence of being completely unseen, of existing in a condition that was designed not only to contain her, but to make her invisible to the world, to the legal and social architecture around her, to the people 8 miles away riding fence lines. She said it simply without accusation, but I have carried it as the accusation it was. I heard a sound behind a barn. I turned toward it, but she had been fighting her way toward that door for 11 weeks before I opened it. The fight was always hers. The survival was always hers. The decision to still be there to walk out when the bolt work finally gave, that was hers in a way that no one could have given her and no one can take credit for. I just opened a door. The rest of it was Nijoni. She came back in April for the trial. She returned my journals. She did not stay long, 3 days, the trial, the testimony, and then the road east again. Jensen was convicted. The sentencing was what the sentencing was, which is its own complicated document. She said goodbye at Lowell's wagon again, which I thought for a moment was a poetic symmetry, and then she reached into the bag and set something on the wagon bench beside her. A journal, small, handmade by the look of it, bound in leather. "You said you write things down so you don't have to carry them alone," she said. "Yes. I've been keeping one," she said, "since December." She looked at it. "I think I understand now why you do it." "Does it help?" She thought about it, the way she thought about things. "It doesn't make the weight less," she said. "But it makes the weight," she paused, Shaped so you can hold it better. Lowell clicked to the team. I'll write to you, she said as the wagon moved, when I have something worth writing. The first letter came in June.